So the first time I built a workbench that I thought looked kind of neat, and I didn't really put any additional thought into it. I'm not going to make the mistake this time. Talking through this will give you some tips that you can use for building your own workbench. Hopefully make it a little bit more functional than it otherwise might have been. Came with a thought process, going to go through that right now. Number one, it's going to seem kind of obvious. What are you going to do with your workbench? I drew up a list here. I'm going to read through it. So what do I plan to do out here? Metal casting, ceramics, some sheet metal shaping, welding, grinding, fabrication, woodworking, bit of electronics, maybe some machining someday. Think, can a workbench, one workbench, actually do all these things? And the answer is no. No, it most certainly cannot. A furniture building woodworking bench is not a welding table. They're very different. They're mutually exclusive. So I'm not even going to worry about all of those. I have enough room to have like multiple workspaces. I'm going to narrow this down. What I want this one to be, this first one, a kind of general purpose workbench, which isn't very helpful, but I want to use this one to build a gingery lathe and also to ram up sand casting molds. You've seen me do that many years ago. Hopefully I'll be doing that again very, very soon. Everything else to worry about in the future in a different workbench. Step two, how are you going to do that? So are you going to be standing up? Do you want a bench? Are you going to be sitting down on like a stool? This matters because your height relative to the bench matters. A fantastic book I got on this subject like 10, 15 years ago, whenever, and reread recently is the Workbench Design book by Christopher Schwartz and some people at Popular Woodworking. It's mostly about woodworking bench, like hand tool woodworking benches, but I think a few of the things he says are very important to think about. First one was, your bench cannot be too long or too heavy, but it can definitely be too tall or too wide. I think he meant like this dimension. And I thought that was kind of interesting because my last workbench, I just did it at 3 feet. I never thought it was too low, but I frequently thought it was too high. You don't want it to be too high so you're not all bunched up, but you're not actually working at workbench surface. You're working at whatever your hand is holding, the tool or whatever, touching whatever work piece you're working on, which is on top of the bench. So in my case here, metal casting, ramming up the sand molds, some of them get kind of thick when you get the multiple pieces stacked up. So if the workbench is at 36 inches, the bottom flask is 4 inches thick. Well, the one they ram on top of that, another 4 inches thick, and you're holding a sand rammer on top of that. So the workbench might be at 36 inches, but I'm like ramming sand, which is a very physical, like kind of pounding motion, 10, 12 inches higher than that. But I don't want to go too much lower, so I'm just going to go down 1 inch, 35 inches. 1 inch might not seem like a big deal, but trust me, that inch matters. No, I'm not making a joke. We're moving on. The other point he made in the book, you want it to be pretty stable. You don't want a workbench that moves all over the place. This is very true of woodworking, but also true of just anything in general. You don't want a table that's all wiggly. And my old workbench accomplished this, even though it was very lightweight, by being bolted to the wall. You might see in the videos, it looks like it's slid up against the wall. It's bolted right to the wall. And I did that because it's bolted to the wall on a hinge, and I can fold it up out of the way, which I thought would have been a very neat, useful thing to have. And I used that feature maybe twice the first 6 months, and never again. But I would have really, really liked to be able to move the thing around the room. So this one will not be bolted to anything. It's got to be freestanding. But that also means it kind of has to have the mass. And I think I can work all these things together, but we'll get to that when we get to the features. And the dimensions, the width and depth, I'm just going with 2x4 because you can get a 2x4 sheet of plywood. Very easy, no need to complicate things. And I'm going to make the whole thing out of 2x4s. And that's because of step number 3 or tip number 3. I really need to plan this better. Don't try to do anything from scratch. Like you can if you want, if you really feel like it, but I just wanted a bench. So I found, or someone sent me this, my friend Dan sent me a video of a guy building a bench that's configurable, and I thought, great, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to adjust it for my purposes. This is the video. You can see there's a table on the front. He made a few variations. I'm going to change it up a bit for metal casting and just other stuff. And here's my variation. I also have a shot without the tops on, but it's not all that different from the guys in the video. So back to the normal one, you can see some differences. First off, I don't have a full bottom shelf, and the bottom shelf I do have is off to the side, and it's significantly lower. I did that because my foundry furnace is on wheels, and I can stick it in that open area next to the shelf, and my bin of sand can sit on that shelf. This will add weight, it'll add that mass that I want to stop the thing from moving around real easy. Also, when I'm taking castings out of the sand, I can just like slide the bin forward and brush the sand right off the top back into the bucket real easy. I also don't have the overhanging top that he has all the way around, and that's because I want to be able to bolt things or like clamp them straight to the legs upright and not have the top get in the way. It's a little easier to clamp things to the legs than not just like on the flimsy overhang of the top. That's why I did that. I'm not going to go super into the build because this isn't my initial design, just the dimensions have changed a little bit. But I did do a couple of things that he says in the video that I think are very important. First off, the edges of these 2x4s are ugly. So before I measured out pieces, I cut a clean edge with a miter saw. Back in the day, I would have used a hand saw for this, but I really don't care about keeping it all fancy and traditional. I just wanted this thing done. I'm still definitely not so comfortable with how easily this machine could remove my fingers and hands. So when I'm building like actual like projects, I'm probably going to stick with hand tools. I also don't like the noise and all the dust and crap, but you can't complain about the speed of this thing. I can't tell you what model it is because I found it in my last garage when I moved into the place, and it does not have a manual. I don't even know what kind of blade that is. That's a blade that was in it when I got it. I could probably take it off and like take a peek, but it seems to cut 2x4s fine. And if it works, is it really the wrong tool? I mean, maybe. I haven't tried the right one as comparison here. So what you're seeing now is I'm trying to assemble the frame that goes on the top itself. It's a 2x4 sheet of 3/4 inch ply that I got at some home center, and I'm hoping the thing is at least square. So I figure if I put this together on that piece, then the boards should be square, right? They should form like a perfect rectangle. And if not, if they're off, then they're off by the exact same amount as the bench top, and I'm not going to notice because I'm not going to measure this. You might be able to tell from drilling, but this was super wet wood, especially visible in those knots. All the stuff came out like almost goopy. When you buy 2x4s at like a home center, you generally don't get dried wood. That's why they warp so badly so quickly. So what I'm doing here is trying to finish this bench while the stuff is still wet, so that when it dries and it starts to warp, it's gonna like be held together with screws and won't warp too bad. I didn't do that when I built that craft table, so I ended up with a couple of like 8-foot boards that were like twisting 30 or 40 degrees by the end. I tried to make it work, but you can definitely notice. For these centerpieces here, I didn't bother like measuring out to exactly space them, like proportionate. I just kind of eyeballed it. I really wanted these not to like stick up and cause a hump in the workbench. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually building this upside down. I probably should have mentioned that. If the boards sit like nice and flat on the plywood, then I know they're not sticking up and the plywood won't rock on it. So I'm referencing everything off the plywood, hoping it's flat and straight, which it might not be, but it's better than the 2x4s and it's better than the table it's sitting on. Then I screwed the top to those things. Nice and easy, like it lined up. Go figure, when I build the things like referencing themselves. I've read in certain books that like when you're building furniture, you don't always want to reference a tape measure, you want to reference the other pieces you have. So if you cut out a mortise or a dovetail or something and it's not perfect, if you reference the one that you already cut out, you get a perfect fit. Instead of always referencing to a measurement and end up with like, what if you screwed up the first one? Then they're not going to work. Of course, then you can't screw up like cutting to the line of the reference, but that's, we don't worry about that. Then back over, I stuck the legs on. I stuck the legs on only with one screw each, mounting the leg to the top. That allows them to move a little bit. You'll see why later. Then when the legs are attached, I kind of stuck all the rest of the leg bits and the stretchers for the bottom shelf on there. Made a slight mistake. The measurement I took for the bottom shelf was a little more than I needed. So I ended up the bottom shelf maybe 3 inches lower than it had to be for clearance with the sand. That's fine. I got a little extra space. Maybe I can stick a shelf on it or something. Who knows? I probably won't though. Then with those on, I kind of just picked it up and swung it down. It's light enough that you can like move this thing around. You don't always want a light workbench, but this won't be very light by the end. It's just nice to be able to maneuver it a little more easily. And then with it on the ground, I stick the bottom shelf on and start screwing stuff back together. Once it's on the ground, the legs have a little bit of wiggle to them. I don't show this on camera, but I kind of I wiggled it so like the legs were sitting firmly, all 4 corners on the ground. This floor is really flat. I'm pretty happy with it. So once it was sitting flat, I just loaded like tons more screws connecting everything together. And that stiffened it up to a degree where it doesn't rack anymore, at least well enough. If this were a woodworking bench, I mean, I'd probably want more than that, but it's not a woodworking bench. I even test fit my bin of sand. This is where I'm finding out that I gave myself more room than I needed, but that's not a problem. The bin is also not 2 feet wide, so there's plenty of room to spare, and that gives me room to stick my furnace like under the other side. It's starting to become more advantageous to be putting all these things on wheels, I would think. Maybe that's a good suggestion. Put stuff on wheels. Like, you don't want a workbench on wheels. You want it to stay in place when you're using it. And locking casters, I don't like locking casters. You'd have to have another thing like swing down casters or something, so when you're using it, the bench is sitting on the floor, not on casters. But anyway, you can see the furnace doesn't go all the way nice and under there. It sticks out a tiny bit, but I'm sure I could, if I really wanted to, I could adjust the shelf or, you know, maybe fix the frame that it's sitting on so it's not bulkier than it needs to be. There's a bunch of ways to fix it, and I'll probably do none of them. And then the finish. I really didn't finish like any of it except the top itself, and this is General Finish's armor seal. Put a few coats on there, probably like 4 or 5 coats. This workbench is going to get pretty destroyed, to be honest, but I figure armor seal will give me a fighting chance. It's a pretty tough coating. I mean, it's certainly not invincible, but it's better than like shellac or nothing. I suppose anything's better than nothing. Trying to move this thing, I left the bin of sand on there to get a sense of how stable it is. And I think I'm pretty close to one of the tips I read in the book. You should be able to move your bench, but not easily. Certainly adding 60 pounds of sand to the base made it a lot more difficult to move. It's still pretty movable though. If this were like a hand tool woodworking bench I'm doing out of planing, I would definitely want this to be about 3 times heavier, at least.